Fix this, kid, and I'll give you 200 million. Michael Thompson's words cut through the operating room's chaos like a scalpel through flesh. He jabbed his finger at 11-year-old Angela, as if she were an insect that had wandered into his mother's surgery. The girl froze in the observation gallery, her small hands pressed against the glass, while her mother, Anna Landers, stood in surgical scrubs below, her face draining of color. Michael's expression twisted with the particular cruelty of desperate men masking terror as contempt. Maybe a kid can fix what these million-dollar specialists can't. No one laughed. The 12 medical professionals in the operating theater were too focused on the screaming alarms, the flatlined monitors, the complete systemic failure of the vital sign monitoring equipment that was supposed to be keeping Michael's mother alive during the most critical phase of her cardiac surgery. Angela stared at the error screens through the observation window with unusual intensity, her dark eyes tracking the cascading red warnings that flashed across multiple displays. Her small fingers twitched at her sides, tracing invisible pathways through circuit diagrams only she could see. None of the frantic doctors and technicians noticed the spark of recognition in the child's eyes, the way her breathing had slowed to focused calm while everyone else's had accelerated to panic. They were about to learn the most expensive and most humbling lesson of their careers. Stay with me until the end because this story will shock you to the core. Before we begin, hit subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Now let's get back into the story. The crisis had begun exactly 47 seconds earlier, when the Integrated Patient Monitoring System, a $500,000 German-engineered marvel that tracked 18 simultaneous vital functions, had crashed spectacularly during the most delicate portion of Mrs. Thompson's mitral valve repair. One moment, the surgical team was working with mechanical precision, guided by real-time data flowing across their screens. The next, every display had gone crimson with error messages, every alarm had triggered simultaneously, and the anesthesiologist had lost all visibility into the patient's oxygen saturation, heart rhythm, and blood pressure. Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief cardiac surgeon whose hands were literally inside a mobster's mother's chest, had frozen mid-suture. "Talk to me. What just happened?" "System crash," the lead surgical technician said, his fingers flying across the diagnostic keyboard. "Complete failure, primary and backup monitoring both offline." "That's impossible," Dr. Sarah Chen, the anesthesiologist, said, though the dark screens in front of her proved otherwise. "These systems have triple redundancy." Now, 90 seconds into the failure, with Mrs. Thompson's life hanging in balance, and no way to monitor whether she was stable or dying, the operating theater had descended into controlled chaos. Michael Thompson watched from the observation gallery, his knuckles white against the railing, his legendary composure fracturing under the weight of watching his mother's surgery collapse. He'd built an empire on intimidation and calculated violence, had survived 3 decades in organized crime by being smarter and more ruthless than his enemies. But he couldn't threaten technology into working, couldn't intimidate medical equipment into compliance, couldn't use any of his considerable power to solve the crisis unfolding below. Standing beside him was Anna Landers, the surgical nurse who'd been pulled from the operating room when additional technicians were needed to troubleshoot the system failure. Anna had worked at Metropolitan Hospital for 15 years, had assisted in thousands of surgeries, had earned respect through competence and quiet dignity in an environment where respect came hard to women who looked like her. And clutching her mother's hand, trying to stay invisible and quiet as she'd been taught, was Angela. The girl had been coming to the hospital since she could walk, spending after-school hours in staff break rooms and observation galleries, while her single mother worked double shifts. While other children played games on tablets, Angela studied the medical equipment around her. Not the medicine itself, but the machines, the elegant complexity of systems designed to keep humans alive through precise monitoring and intervention. She'd taught herself electronics from discarded technical manuals, had learned to read circuit diagrams before she'd mastered multiplication tables, had developed an intuitive, almost savant-level understanding of how complex systems integrated, failed, and could be restored. Her playground had been the medical technology storage rooms. Her lullabies were the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors and the whisper of ventilators. Her education came from observing technicians troubleshoot equipment, from listening to engineers explain problems to frustrated doctors, from seeing patterns that adults missed because they were looking at individual components rather than systemic relationships. Below them, Dr. Webb made a command decision. We continue the procedure manually. Dr. Chen, you're monitoring by touch and observation only. Call out any changes immediately. Marcus, that's insane, Dr. Chen protested. We're flying blind. One missed arrhythmia, one oxygen desaturation we don't catch, and if we stop now, she dies on the table, Dr. Webb interrupted. At least this way we have a chance. Three medical technicians huddled around the monitoring system's main console, their laptops connected via emergency diagnostic ports, their expressions showing the particular frustration of highly trained professionals confronting inexplicable failure. The error logs make no sense, one muttered. It's showing peripheral device connection failure, but all the peripherals are registering as connected. Run the diagnostic protocol again, another said, though his tone suggested he didn't expect different results. Michael's phone buzzed incessantly. Lieutenants, lawyers, business associates, all aware that his mother was in surgery, all needing decisions that he couldn't focus on while watching the woman who'd raised him hover between life and death. His facade cracked for just a moment, terror bleeding through before he slammed the control back into place. Men in his position couldn't show weakness, couldn't reveal the desperate love that existed beneath the calculated cruelty, couldn't admit that all his power meant nothing when faced with mortality and machines that refused to obey. So he did what powerful, frightened men often do. He lashed out at the nearest vulnerable target. This is pathetic, Michael announced to the observation gallery, his voice carrying the contempt that masked helplessness. $500,000 for equipment that fails during the one surgery that matters. Specialists with degrees from every prestigious institution standing around like confused children. His eyes landed on Angela, the only actual child present, and something vicious stirred in his expression. You, he said, pointing at her with the same finger that had ordered executions and business deals. Fix this, kid, and I'll give you $200 million. If you can't stand the way Michael just mocked that little girl, hit subscribe right now. Only people who side with bullies would keep scrolling. The words hung in the air, cruel and mocking, an impossible challenge issued to humiliate rather than solve, to create a moment of bitter humor in circumstances that offered none. Anna's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. Mr. Thompson, please, she's just standing there staring at screens she can't possibly understand, Michael finished. Like everyone else in this hospital, apparently. But Angela wasn't staring with confusion. Her eyes tracked the error cascades with the focused intensity of someone reading a language others couldn't see. Her brilliant, unconventional mind had already identified what the specialists had missed, a simple, elegant flaw buried in the complexity they were too credentialed to notice. The adults were about to learn that genius doesn't wait for permission, doesn't require credentials, and sometimes speaks in the voice of an 11-year-old girl who's been invisible her entire life. Angela took a breath and stepped forward to the intercom that connected the observation gallery to the operating room below. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice small but clear. "I think I know what's wrong." Metropolitan Hospital's cardiovascular surgery suite occupied the entire fifth floor of the East Wing, a temple to modern medical technology, where the city's wealthiest and most powerful came when their mortality could no longer be ignored or intimidated. The operating theater itself was a masterpiece of engineering, Temperature controlled to exactly 68 degrees, humidity maintained at optimal levels, air filtered through HEPA systems that eliminated 99.9% of potential contaminants. Every surface gleamed with antiseptic precision. Surgical lights blazed with the intensity of miniature suns, casting no shadows, revealing every detail of the human body exposed beneath them. Equipment worth millions surrounded the operating table like mechanical attendants, ventilators, anesthesia machines, surgical robots, and the crown jewel, the integrated patient monitoring system that transformed invisible vital functions into visible, quantifiable data. This was where medicine performed its most delicate miracles, where skilled hands and sophisticated technology collaborated to repair hearts that had forgotten how to beat correctly, to rebuild valves that had worn out after decades of faithful service. Today, lying on the operating table was Margaret Thompson, 73 years old, mother of the city's most feared organized crime figure, suffering from severe mitral valve regurgitation that had progressed from manageable condition to life-threatening crisis over the past 6 months. The surgery itself, mitral valve repair with possible replacement, was complex, but routine for a team of Dr. Webb's caliber. He'd performed hundreds of these procedures, had pioneered several techniques that reduced recovery time and improved outcomes. Under normal circumstances, Margaret Thompson's prognosis would be excellent. But circumstances stopped being normal the moment her son arrived at the hospital. Michael Thompson occupied space the way predators occupy territory, with absolute authority and the implicit threat of violence against anything that challenged his dominance. He was 48, built like someone who'd maintained the physical discipline of his street enforcer days, despite decades of commanding from behind desks and bulletproof vehicles. His suit was custom-tailored, his jewelry understated but expensive, his presence transforming the sterile observation gallery into something that felt more like a throne room than medical space. He'd arrived with an entourage that hospital security had reluctantly allowed through, 2 bodyguards who waited outside the surgical floor, a lawyer who'd insisted on reviewing all consent forms personally, and the particular aura of someone accustomed to bending institutions to his will through a combination of money, influence, and carefully implied consequences. The hospital administration had been accommodating to the point of obsequiousness. Private surgical suite, hand-selected team, visiting hours waived, security protocols adjusted. They understood that Michael Thompson's goodwill meant substantial donations to the hospital foundation. His displeasure meant problems that extended beyond lost funding into territories no administrator wanted to contemplate. But for all his power, Michael couldn't control what happened once his mother was anesthetized and opened on that operating table. Couldn't threaten the biology that had weakened her heart valve. Couldn't intimidate the surgical complications that arose despite the best planning and preparation. He stood now at the observation window, his hands gripping the railing with enough force to whiten his knuckles, his face a carefully maintained mask of cold composure that didn't quite hide the terror beneath. Michael Thompson had watched men die, had ordered deaths, had personally delivered violence when necessary to maintain his position. But watching his mother's chest opened, her heart exposed and vulnerable, her life dependent on the skill of strangers and the reliability of machines was entirely different. This was helplessness, the one thing his empire couldn't protect him from. Margaret Thompson had raised him alone after his father was killed in a territory dispute when Michael was 7. She'd worked 3 jobs to keep him fed, had looked the other way when he'd started running with the wrong crowds because the wrong crowds paid better than the right ones, had eventually accepted that her son had chosen a life she couldn't condone but wouldn't abandon him for choosing. She'd never asked about his business, never spent money she suspected came from illegal sources, had maintained a careful separation between her life and his empire. But when she'd collapsed in her kitchen 6 months ago, when the diagnosis had come back showing her heart was failing, Michael had deployed every resource at his disposal. The best cardiologists, the most advanced diagnostics, treatment protocols that weren't yet available to general public. He'd researched hospitals across 3 countries, had selected Metropolitan because Dr. Webb's outcomes were statistically superior, had arranged everything down to the smallest detail because control was the only weapon he had against the chaos of mortality. And still, despite all his preparation, despite the hundreds of thousands he'd spent ensuring the best possible care, his mother's life was balanced on the edge of uncertainty. Dr. Webb had warned him the surgery carried risks. Valve repair was preferable to replacement, but more technically demanding. Margaret's age and condition made her a marginal candidate. There was a 15% chance of complications during the procedure: stroke, heart attack, catastrophic bleeding. Michael had listened to these warnings with the same expression he wore during business negotiations, calculating odds and acceptable losses. 15% risk was better than the 100% certainty of death if they did nothing. But now, watching from above, seeing his mother's body so small and fragile beneath the surgical lights, Michael felt the full weight of that 15%. Felt the terror of having staked everything on probabilities and professional competence, of having placed his mother's life in hands he couldn't control. The surgery had been progressing well for the first 90 minutes. Dr. Webb's hands moved with practiced confidence. The team operated with the synchronized efficiency of people who'd worked hundreds of procedures together. The monitoring systems showed stable vital signs, controlled anesthesia depth, precise blood chemistry. Michael had allowed himself to believe it would be okay. That money and planning and his careful selection of the best team had purchased safety. That his mother would survive this, would recover, would have a few more years where he could be the son she'd raised rather than the criminal he'd become. Then the alarms started screaming, and Michael Thompson learned that some problems couldn't be solved through power, money, or violence. Some problems required something he didn't have. And standing beside him in the observation gallery, invisible and overlooked, was the 11-year-old girl who possessed exactly what he needed. Anna Landers had perfected the art of being essential while remaining invisible, a skill developed over 15 years of navigating hospital hierarchies, where competence without credentials meant serving rather than leading, supporting rather than deciding. She was 34, a single mother who'd entered nursing through a community college program after her daughter's father had disappeared when Angela was 2. Anna had built a career on reliability, on showing up for every shift, regardless of personal circumstances, on executing orders with precision while keeping observations to herself unless specifically asked. The surgical team respected her work. Doctors requested her for their procedures because Anna anticipated needs, maintained sterile fields flawlessly, and never created drama in high-stress environments. But respect didn't translate to visibility. She was valued the way good equipment was valued, noticed primarily when absent or malfunctioning. Today, she'd been assigned to Mrs. Thompson's mitral valve repair, a routine placement until hospital administration had learned whose mother was on the table. Then the assignment had become political, requiring someone reliable enough to handle complex surgery, but expendable enough that complaints from the patient's powerful son wouldn't damage important careers. Anna had accepted the assignment without comment, as she accepted everything, with professional grace and private resignation. She needed this job, needed the health insurance that covered Angela's asthma medication, needed the predictable schedule that allowed her to coordinate childcare, needed the modest but steady salary that kept them housed and fed in a city where poverty was always one emergency away. She couldn't afford to be noticed for the wrong reasons, to draw attention that might cost her the security she'd built through careful, invisible service, which made Angela's presence in the observation gallery a source of constant, low-grade anxiety. The girl sat in the corner with her backpack and homework, theoretically working on math assignments while her mother worked below. This arrangement had become normal over the past 3 years, since after-school programs ended at 4, and Anna's shifts often ran until 7. Hospital administrators tolerated it because Anna was valuable enough that accommodating her childcare situation was easier than replacing her. But Angela had never been content with quiet homework. She watched. She studied. She absorbed the world of medical technology with the focused intensity of someone encountering their native language after years of speaking dialects. Anna had first recognized her daughter's unusual abilities when Angela was 6, when she'd fixed the broken tablet that Anna had been ready to discard. "The charging port was loose, Mama. I just reconnected the internal wire." Simple explanation delivered with the confidence of someone who'd looked inside the device and understood its architecture intuitively. Over the following years, Angela had progressed from fixing household electronics to understanding increasingly complex systems. She'd taught herself programming from library books. She'd studied circuit diagrams like other children read comic books. She'd developed the ability to visualize how electrical systems integrated, where power flowed, where signals traveled, where failures occurred. Anna had tried to encourage traditional education, pushed Angela toward good grades, toward the gifted program at her underfunded public school, toward the kind of conventional achievement that might earn scholarships and opportunities. But Angela's genius was too specialized, too focused on systems and machines, rather than the standardized testing that determined academic placement. Teachers called her scattered, said she didn't apply herself to required subjects, noted that she doodled circuit diagrams during history class, and disassembled the classroom computer to see how it worked when she should have been writing essays. The school counselor had gently suggested that Angela might have attention issues, might benefit from medication to help her focus. Anna had refused. She recognized that Angela's attention wasn't deficit, it was differently allocated. Her daughter could focus with laser intensity on problems that interested her, could spend hours troubleshooting malfunctioning equipment, could see patterns in complex systems that escape trained technicians. But that kind of unconventional brilliance didn't translate to opportunities for poor black girls in underfunded schools. It translated to being seen as difficult, distracted, not living up to potential measured by standards that had nothing to do with actual capability. So Anna had learned to manage expectations, to accept that her daughter's genius might never be recognized in ways that mattered institutionally. She'd hoped that Angela would eventually find her path, maybe through technical college or apprenticeship with a patient mentor who could see past demographics to capability. What Anna feared most was Angela drawing the wrong kind of attention, speaking out of turn in environments where children were expected to be silent, demonstrating knowledge that made adults uncomfortable, being visible in ways that invited judgment or dismissal or the particular cruelty that people directed at those who didn't know their designated place. Today, with Michael Thompson in the observation gallery, with his mother on the operating table, with tension thick enough to taste, Anna's fear intensified. She'd caught Angela staring at the monitoring equipment with that focused expression Anna recognized, the look that meant her daughter was processing, analyzing, understanding systems at a level that would seem impossible to anyone who didn't know her capabilities. "Angela, homework," Anna had whispered during a brief moment when she'd been pulled from the OR for the system failure. "Don't look at the screens. Don't say anything. Just sit quietly until I can take you home." Angela had nodded, but her eyes had drifted back to the error displays almost immediately. Anna had seen her daughter's fingers start their unconscious tracing of invisible circuits, the physical manifestation of Angela's mind mapping pathways and connections. And then Michael Thompson had issued his cruel, mocking challenge, and Anna's carefully maintained invisibility shattered. Because her brilliant, unconventional, overlooked daughter had just been invited, no, dared, to demonstrate exactly the kind of genius that Anna had spent years teaching her to hide. Anna's hands had gone cold. Her heart had started racing. Every instinct screamed at her to pull Angela away, to remove her from this situation before she could be humiliated or blamed or exposed to the kind of attention that would mark her as different in ways their circumstances couldn't afford. But Angela was already standing, already moving toward the intercom, already preparing to speak the truth that no one expected a child to possess. And Anna, trapped between protective instinct and the dawning recognition that her daughter's moment had arrived whether she was ready or not, could only watch as Angela stepped into visibility she could never retreat from. The collapse began with a single, aberrant beep, a tone that didn't belong in the symphony of sounds that accompanied successful surgery. Dr. Webb registered it peripherally, his focus still on the delicate suture he was placing in Margaret Thompson's repaired mitral valve, but somewhere in his subconscious, alarms triggered. Then, the aberrant beep multiplied into a cascade of warnings, each alarm system triggering in sequence like dominoes falling, until the operating room filled with overlapping electronic screams that transformed organized procedure into sensory chaos. "What's happening?" Dr. Webb asked, his hands frozen mid-motion, years of training overriding the instinct to jerk away from his patient's exposed heart. Dr. Chen's voice carried the first edge of panic. "I've lost all monitoring. Blood pressure, oxygen saturation, heart rhythm, everything just went dark." The words sent ice through everyone in the room. Modern surgery was predicated on visibility, the ability to see not just the physical structures being repaired, but the invisible vital functions that kept patients alive during the controlled trauma of invasive procedures. Losing that visibility was like performing surgery blindfolded, navigating by touch alone through territory where a single wrong move meant death. "Backup systems," Dr. Webb said, his voice carrying forced calm. "Switch to backup monitoring." "Already trying," the lead surgical technician said, his fingers flying across the emergency control panel. "Backups aren't responding. The entire integrated system is frozen." The main monitoring displays that had been showing Margaret Thompson's vital signs in real time, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, respiratory function, anesthesia depth, blood chemistry, had all gone crimson, replaced by cascading error messages in technical language that meant nothing to the surgeons, but everything to the technicians trying desperately to restore function. Critical system failure, peripheral device connection, error monitoring protocol, suspended manual override, unavailable diagnostic mode, initiated. Dr. Chen moved to manual assessment, her hands checking pulse points, her eyes watching chest rise and fall, her training reverting to methods that predated electronic monitoring. "Pulse feels steady, breathing looks regular, but I'm operating on approximation, not data. If something changes subtly, I won't catch it until it becomes catastrophic." Two additional surgical technicians rushed into the OR, summoned by the alarm cascade, their laptops already open and running diagnostic protocols. They converged on the main console, speaking in the rapid technical shorthand of people troubleshooting critical failures. Error logs showing cascade from the primary monitoring hub. Peripheral connections registering as connected but not transmitting data. Tried forcing reboot. System locked in diagnostic loop. Dr. Webb made the calculation that surgical leaders had to make when circumstances departed from optimal. Current status of the repair? His senior assistant, Dr. Patricia Morrison, reviewed the exposed heart with clinical precision. "Valve repair is complete. Sutures look good. No visible bleeding. But we still need to close, and that's another 40 minutes minimum. She can't stay under anesthesia without monitoring for 40 minutes. "Then we work faster," Dr. Webb said. "Dr. Chen, you're monitoring manually. Call out anything, any change in breathing pattern, any irregularity in pulse, anything that feels wrong." "Marcus, that's insane," Dr. Chen repeated, her objection more forceful now. "Manual monitoring for complex cardiac surgery? If she develops an arrhythmia, if her oxygen drops, if her blood pressure spikes, I might not catch it in time. This isn't 1950. We don't fly blind anymore for exactly this reason." "What's the alternative?" Dr. Webb's voice carried the weight of impossible decisions. Wake her up with her chest still open? Hope the monitoring system repairs itself before complications develop? We're committed. The only way forward is through. The room's tension ratcheted higher. 12 highly trained professionals, accustomed to working with technological support that transformed uncertainty into quantifiable risk, were suddenly operating in a fog of unknowns. Margaret Thompson's life depended on their ability to maintain surgical precision while monitoring her status through methods that were obsolete precisely because they were unreliable. Above them in the observation gallery, Michael Thompson watched his mother's life balance on this impossible situation. The alarms were muted through the glass but visible in the team's body language. The rigid postures, the hurried consultations, the way Dr. Webb's hands had stilled mid-procedure. "What's the problem?" Michael demanded, his voice carrying across to Anna, who'd been pulled from the OR when additional technical support was needed. "The monitoring system crashed," Anna said quietly, trying to keep her explanation clinical, professional. "They're trying to restore it, but until they do, the surgery has to proceed without electronic vital sign monitoring." "How long can they operate without monitoring?" Anna hesitated, not wanting to voice the truth but knowing evasion would be worse. "Minutes, maybe. Not the 40 minutes they need to close. If something goes wrong and they don't detect it immediately—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Michael understood mortality arithmetic well enough to calculate the odds. Below them, the three technicians continued their desperate troubleshooting, running every diagnostic protocol, attempting every reset procedure, executing the technological equivalent of emergency resuscitation on equipment that should have been foolproof. "This doesn't make sense," one of the techs muttered. "This system has triple redundancy. Primary, backup, and tertiary monitoring should all be independent. For all three to fail simultaneously suggests either catastrophic hardware failure across multiple systems or— Or what?" his colleague demanded. "Or something so simple we're not seeing it because we're looking for complex problems." The irony would have been bitter if anyone had time to appreciate it. They were experts trained to solve sophisticated technical failures, equipped with diagnostic software that could identify problems down to individual component level. But sometimes expertise became liability, leading trained minds to overlook simple solutions because they seemed too obvious to be correct. Margaret Thompson's heart continued beating beneath Dr. Webb's suspended hands. Her lungs continued expanding and contracting under mechanical ventilation. Her body continued the biological processes that sustained life, oblivious to the technological crisis surrounding it. But how long could that continue without the careful calibration that electronic monitoring provided? How long before some subtle deviation went unnoticed until it became irreversible? The clock was running. Every second without restored monitoring was another second of compounding risk. And in the observation gallery, an 11-year-old girl stared at the error displays with focused intensity, her brilliant mind already having identified what the experts were missing. A flaw so simple it was almost elegant, hiding in plain sight behind the complexity everyone was chasing. Angela knew the answer. The question was whether anyone would listen when she spoke it. Michael Thompson's composure fractured gradually. Then all at once, he'd maintained control through the first 30 seconds of the crisis, his face a mask of cold calculation, while his mind processed the implications of system failure during his mother's open-heart surgery. He'd built an empire by staying rational when others panicked, by making strategic decisions while chaos swirled around him. But watching his mother's life hang in balance while supposed experts stood helpless, watching precious seconds tick away while credentialed professionals offered nothing but technical explanations for why they couldn't solve the problem, Michael felt control slipping through his fingers like water. His hands tightened on the observation gallery railing until his knuckles went white. His jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth ache. Sweat appeared at his temples despite the gallery's careful climate control. The fear he'd been suppressing since his mother's collapse 6 months ago rose up with suffocating intensity. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice low and dangerous. $500,000 for equipment that fails at the worst possible moment. World-class specialists standing around like confused children. Anna stood a few feet away, her body language broadcasting the desire to be anywhere else, her eyes flickering between the crisis below and her daughter in the corner. She'd learned to recognize the particular tone in Michael's voice, the one that preceded violence or cruelty, or the kind of calculated destruction that powerful, desperate men inflicted when circumstances made them feel helpless. "Mr. Thompson, they're doing everything they can," Anna said quietly, trying to offer reassurance that sounded hollow even to her ears. "These technicians are the best in the hospital. If anyone can restore the system, they can." "The best?" Michael turned toward her, his expression twisting into something ugly. "The best would have prevented this failure. The best would have backup systems that actually work. The best wouldn't be standing around debating error codes while my mother dies on that table." His phone buzzed again, the fifth call in 3 minutes that he'd ignored. People from his organization needing decisions, requiring guidance, expecting the boss to be available for the business that never stopped regardless of personal crisis. Michael silenced it with more force than necessary, his finger stabbing the button like he was executing the caller. "15 years I've been donating to this hospital," he continued, his voice rising. "Millions in contributions to their foundation, new equipment, research funding, wing renovations, and when it matters, when my mother needs them to be competent, they can't even keep their fancy German monitoring system functioning for the length of one surgery." Below them, the technicians continued their desperate troubleshooting, oblivious to the fury building in the gallery above. Dr. Webb had resumed work, his hands moving with forced confidence through a procedure that had transformed from routine to terrifying, while Dr. Chen called out observations based on manual assessment that couldn't possibly capture the precise data electronic monitoring provided. Michael's eyes tracked the room, looking for a target for his rage, for someone to blame, for anything that would make him feel less helpless. His gaze landed on the error screens visible through the observation window, cascading red warnings, technical language that might as well have been hieroglyphics, the visual representation of failure. Then his eyes shifted to Angela. The girl sat in the corner with her backpack, but she wasn't doing homework. Her attention was locked on those same error screens with unusual intensity, her small face reflecting the red glow of the displays, her fingers tracing patterns on her legs that Michael couldn't interpret. Something in Michael's expression changed, calculation mixing with cruelty, desperation breeding the particular viciousness that came from powerful people confronting their own impotence. He'd spent his career controlling situations through intimidation and strategic dominance. When those tools failed, when he was reduced to watching and waiting like everyone else, some part of him needed to reassert dominance through whatever means remained. "You," Michael said, his voice cutting across the gallery. He pointed at Angela with the same finger that had ordered executions, bribed officials, sealed business deals worth millions. "Fix this, kid, and I'll give you 200 million. The words emerged as mockery rather than genuine offer, a bitter joke delivered by someone who needed to hurt something because he couldn't fix what actually mattered. $200 million was a figure calculated to emphasize absurdity, to highlight the ridiculousness of thinking that a child could solve what trained specialists couldn't. Angela's head turned toward him, her dark eyes meeting his gaze with a directness that most adults avoided when Michael was in this mood. She didn't look intimidated or confused. She looked focused, as if she was assessing whether he was serious despite the cruelty in his tone. "Mr. Thompson, please." Anna moved toward her daughter instinctively, her voice carrying desperation. "She's just a child. She doesn't—" "Just a child, sitting there staring at screens she can't possibly understand," Michael interrupted, his mockery expanding to include Anna now, encompassing both mother and daughter in his need to create targets for rage he couldn't direct at the actual problem. Like all of us, apparently, standing around helpless while the experts figure out what went wrong with their precious technology. He gestured broadly at the error displays. 200 million, kid. That's what I'll pay if you can walk down there and fix what these $1 million specialists can't. Hell, I'll make it 300 million. Why not? Apparently, credentials and training and expensive education don't mean anything when equipment fails. His voice dripped with contempt. For the medical team, for the technology, for the circumstances that had reduced him to watching his mother's life drain away, while he could do nothing but stand behind glass and rage at his impotence. Maybe we should all just guess, Michael continued, his cruelty building momentum. Maybe we should let children troubleshoot critical medical equipment. Maybe competence and expertise are overrated concepts and we should just— I know what's wrong with it, Angela said. The words were quiet, delivered without dramatics or force, just simple statement of fact from a child who'd been addressed directly and had decided to respond honestly. The gallery went silent. Michael's expression froze mid-sneer, his brain requiring a moment to process that the target of his mockery had just claimed knowledge that contradicted the entire premise of his cruel joke. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone shifting from mockery to something harder to define. Confusion, mixed with irritation, mixed with the faintest possibility of desperate hope. Angela stood up slowly, her backpack sliding off her lap, her small frame straightening with a confidence that seemed incongruous with her age and circumstances. She walked toward the observation window, toward the error displays that filled the screens below, her eyes tracking the cascading warnings with practiced ease. "I said I know what's wrong with your monitoring system," Angela repeated, her voice steady despite the weight of adult attention suddenly focused on her. "It's not actually broken. It's just looking in the wrong place for something that got disconnected." Michael stared at her, his mockery colliding with the possibility that this overlooked child might possess exactly what he needed. The moment stretched, suspended between cruelty and desperate hope, between dismissing her claim as childish fantasy and allowing himself to believe that salvation might come from the most unlikely source. "You're serious," he said finally, though his tone made it half question, half accusation. "Yes, sir," Angela said simply. "Would you like me to explain what's wrong, or would you prefer I just tell them how to fix it?" Anna's hand closed around Angela's arm with desperate urgency, her touch firm enough to communicate panic without hurting. Years of protective instinct, of shielding her daughter from attention that could mark them as different or difficult or above their station, flooded through her system with adrenaline clarity. "Angela, no," Anna whispered, trying to pull her daughter away from the observation window, away from Michael Thompson's attention, away from a situation that could only end in humiliation or worse. "Baby, please, let's just go back to your seat. Let the technicians handle this." But Angela resisted with surprising strength, her feet planted, her body language communicating a determination Anna rarely saw in her typically compliant daughter. The girl's eyes remained locked on the error displays below, tracking patterns with the focused intensity of someone reading critical information rather than random warnings. "Mama, I can fix it," Angela said quietly. "I can see what they're missing." "You don't know that." Anna's voice carried the desperate edge of a mother trying to protect her child from inevitable disappointment. "Sweetheart, those are trained professionals down there. Medical technicians with years of education and experience. You can't possibly—" "I do know it," Angela interrupted gently, her gaze never leaving the screens. "Look at error code PT447. That's peripheral device timeout, and right below it, MD203, monitoring data stream interruption. Those aren't system failures. Those are connection errors. Something got physically disconnected, or the connection degraded enough that data transmission stopped." Anna felt her stomach drop. Her daughter was speaking with the precise technical language of someone who understood these systems at a fundamental level, using terminology Anna recognized from years of overhearing technician conversations but couldn't have explained herself. "Even if that's true," Anna said, changing tactics, "you can't just announce it. Mr. Thompson is angry and desperate. If you're wrong, if you embarrass him or waste time or... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fears about what a man like Michael Thompson might do if a child made him look foolish in a moment of crisis. Michael watched this exchange with expressions cycling between irritation and something else, calculation perhaps, or the desperate willingness to grasp at any possibility when conventional solutions had failed. His cruel challenge had been mockery, but Angela's response had transformed it into something more complicated. "Let her talk," Michael said, his voice carrying the command of someone accustomed to obedience. "She claims she knows what's wrong. Let's hear it." "Mr. Thompson, she's 11, Anna pleaded, her professionalism fracturing under maternal protectiveness. "She doesn't have training or credentials. She's just a child who's spent time around medical equipment. She can't possibly diagnose complex system failures that trained technicians." "The trained technicians aren't solving it," Michael interrupted, his patience clearly exhausted. "Your daughter says she can. Either let her explain or get her out of this gallery so I don't have to look at one more person who can't help my mother." The words hit like physical blows, the casual cruelty of powerful people who viewed service staff as interchangeable furniture, easily dismissed when they ceased being useful. Anna felt the familiar sting of being reminded exactly where she stood in the hospital's hierarchy, exactly how disposable she was despite 15 years of competent service. But beneath the hurt, beneath the fear for her daughter, something else stirred. Anger, maybe, or recognition that Angela deserved better than being silenced because adults were too invested in credentials and hierarchy to listen to truth regardless of its source. Anna looked at her daughter, really looked at her, seeing not the child who needed protection, but the brilliant mind she'd been trying to shield from a world that wouldn't appreciate unconventional genius. Angela's focus remained absolute, her eyes tracking error code sequences, her fingers tracing invisible circuit paths, her entire being engaged with the problem at a level that transcended her age and circumstances. "Okay," Anna said quietly, releasing her daughter's arm, making a choice she couldn't take back. "Tell them what you see." Angela's expression showed relief mixed with determination. She turned to the intercom that connected the observation gallery to the operating room below, her small hand reaching for the button that would make her voice audible to the medical team. But before she pressed it, she looked back at her mother one more time, seeking confirmation that she really had permission to step into visibility, to demonstrate knowledge that would mark her forever as different, unusual, potentially threatening to adults invested in maintaining their expertise and authority. Anna nodded, her heart hammering, her professional survival instincts screaming warnings, but her maternal recognition of Angela's moment overriding every cautious impulse. Angela pressed the intercom button. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and carrying despite its youth. "I think I know what's wrong with your monitoring system." Below in the operating room, the frantic activity paused. Heads turned toward the intercom speaker, expressions showing confusion about why a child's voice was interrupting critical troubleshooting. The lead surgical technician's face reflected annoyance. This was no time for interruptions from observers who didn't understand the complexity of what they were dealing with. "Not now," he said curtly, returning attention to his diagnostic laptop. "We're working on it." "I know you are," Angela continued, undeterred by dismissal. "But you're looking for software failures or hardware problems. This isn't either. It's a connection issue with the peripheral monitoring nodes." The technician's hands paused on his keyboard. Something in Angela's specific language, peripheral monitoring nodes rather than vague equipment terminology, had penetrated his irritation. He looked up at the observation window, seeing Angela's small figure pressed against the glass, her eyes still tracking the error displays with that unusual focus. "What do you mean, connection issue?" he asked, his tone still skeptical, but no longer dismissive. Angela took a breath, organizing her explanation into language that would translate her intuitive understanding into terms the technicians could verify. She'd been watching these systems for years, had studied their architecture in stolen moments, had developed a mental model of how data flowed from patient sensors through integration hubs to display terminals. The error codes are telling you that peripheral devices aren't sending data, Angela explained. PT447 means the system times out waiting for sensor input. MD203 means the monitoring data stream is interrupted, but your diagnostics show all devices are connected and powered, which is why you're confused. That's correct, the technician admitted grudgingly. The system registers everything as connected, but no data is flowing. We've been trying to identify which component failed. Nothing failed, Angela said with quiet confidence. But something disconnected. Look at the auxiliary power distribution node, the small junction box behind the main console. There's a master data cable that connects all the peripheral sensors to the central monitoring system. If that cable's connection has degraded just enough to interrupt data transmission, but not enough to register as completely disconnected, you get exactly these error codes. The technician's expression transformed from skepticism to sudden possibility. Angela's explanation aligned with symptoms in a way that sophisticated diagnostic software had missed, because it was looking for complex problems rather than simple physical failures. Check the auxiliary node, he called to his colleague. Main data trunk connection. Anna watched from above, her hand pressed to her mouth, her professional life potentially ending, while her daughter's extraordinary mind finally revealed itself to people who might actually appreciate what they were seeing. Michael Thompson stood beside her, his mockery forgotten, his attention riveted on the small girl who'd just diagnosed a critical failure in seconds, while experts had floundered for minutes. Below them, a technician reached behind the main console and located the junction box Angela had identified. His hands found the data cable connection, tested it gently, and felt the slight looseness that shouldn't exist in properly secured medical equipment. "She's right," he said, his voice carrying disbelief and dawning respect. "The connection's degraded. It's reading as connected but not transmitting reliably." He pressed the connection firmly home, ensuring full contact, and the operating room's chaos transformed instantly into the ordered symphony of functioning technology. The alarms ceased. The error displays cleared. The monitoring screens flickered back to life, showing Margaret Thompson's vital signs resuming their steady, reassuring patterns. The crisis was over. The system was restored. The surgery could proceed with the technological support that made modern medicine possible. And an 11-year-old girl had accomplished what credentialed experts couldn't, in a moment that would change multiple lives forever. The moment stretched as everyone in the operating room processed what had just happened. 12 medical professionals, equipped with hundreds of thousands of dollars in diagnostic equipment and decades of combined training, had been troubleshooting unsuccessfully for nearly 3 minutes, while a child watching from above had identified the problem in seconds. Dr. Webb's hands remained suspended over Margaret Thompson's exposed heart, his mind recalibrating from crisis mode to the cautious relief of restored functionality. "Confirm all systems operational," he said, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who'd just narrowly avoided catastrophe. "Heart rate stable at 72, Dr. Chen reported, her eyes scanning the revived displays with the intensity of someone verifying miracle against reality. "Blood pressure 120/80, oxygen saturation 98%, anesthesia depth optimal. All parameters nominal." The monitoring screens showed the beautiful rhythmic data that transformed invisible biological processes into visible, quantifiable information. Every vital sign within expected ranges, every measurement confirming that Margaret Thompson had weathered the monitoring crisis without complication, that the repair to her heart was holding, that the surgery could continue with the technological support that made precision possible. "Resume normal protocol," Dr. Webb instructed, his confidence returning as certainty replaced uncertainty. His hands moved again, completing the sutures that would close the repair site, beginning the systematic process of returning his patient from the vulnerable exposure of surgery toward the protected recovery of healing. The surgical team synchronized back into practiced efficiency. But the atmosphere had changed. An 11-year-old girl had just demonstrated diagnostic capability that exceeded their combined expertise, had identified a simple physical failure that their sophisticated software had overlooked, had solved their crisis with the kind of elegant simplicity that made professionals question whether their training had made them too specialized to see obvious solutions. In the observation gallery, Angela stepped back from the intercom, her focus finally breaking now that the crisis had resolved. She looked small suddenly, her moment of authoritative diagnosis giving way to the reality of being a child in an adult space, potentially having caused disruption rather than providing help. "Did I do okay?" she asked her mother quietly, uncertainty replacing the confidence she'd shown while explaining the technical failure. Anna's response caught in her throat, too many emotions competing for expression. Pride that her daughter had been right, that Angela's unconventional brilliance had proven itself undeniably. Fear about consequences that couldn't yet be calculated, about how this visibility would mark them both. Relief that the patient had survived, that Angela's intervention had succeeded rather than causing additional complications. "You did more than okay," Anna managed finally, pulling her daughter into an embrace that communicated everything words couldn't. "You saved that woman's life. You did what trained professionals couldn't do." Michael Thompson remained at the observation window, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been humility forced upon someone not accustomed to acknowledging debts or limitations. His cruel challenge had been mockery intended to emphasize absurdity. Angela's response had transformed mockery into prophecy, had made Michael's impossible offer suddenly, terrifyingly real. $200 million. That's what he'd promised. A figure selected to highlight ridiculousness, to make clear that fixing the problem was impossible, and any claim to capability was childish fantasy. But Angela hadn't just claimed capability, she'd demonstrated it, quickly and precisely, with the kind of technical fluency that couldn't be faked or fabricated. Michael pulled out his phone, his fingers moving across the screen with the mechanical precision of someone needing activity to process impossible information. He wasn't calling anyone, wasn't checking messages. He was calculating, running the arithmetic of a promise made in cruelty but delivered in witness, trying to determine whether an offer issued as mockery carried the weight of actual commitment. Below them, the surgery progressed with renewed confidence. Dr. Webb worked methodically through the closure procedures, his hands steady now that monitoring had returned. The crisis moment had passed, replaced by the routine excellence that made complex cardiac surgery survivable. But nothing about this surgery would be remembered as routine. The story would spread through Metropolitan Hospital with the speed of revelation. The monitoring crisis solved by a nurse's daughter. The child genius who'd diagnosed what experts had missed. The 11-year-old who'd spoken truth to power and been proven absolutely, undeniably correct. Anna felt the weight of that future visibility settling over them both. Yesterday, she and Angela had been invisible, valuable but overlooked, competent but unremarkable, safely navigating hierarchies by knowing their designated place and staying within it. Today, Angela had stepped out of invisibility and into a spotlight that couldn't be dimmed or redirected. She'd demonstrated capability that would mark her forever as exceptional, unusual, potentially threatening to adults who'd built careers on credentials and training that a child had just proven insufficient. The technician who'd verified Angela's diagnosis appeared at the observation gallery door, his expression carrying the particular humility of someone forced to acknowledge that expertise had blind spots. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Anna because Angela was clearly a child and adults communicated with adults about important matters. "Your daughter, what's her name?" "Angela," Anna said quietly. "Angela Landers." "Angela," the technician repeated, looking at the girl directly now with an expression that mixed respect and confusion. That was remarkable diagnosis. How did you know to check the auxiliary power node? That's not common knowledge, even among medical technicians. Angela shrugged, suddenly shy under direct adult attention that wasn't dismissive or mocking. I've watched these systems a lot. I like understanding how they work. The error codes made a pattern that suggested physical connection failure rather than software or hardware problems. You like understanding how they work, the technician echoed, his tone suggesting he recognized that Angela's casual explanation vastly understated whatever process her mind had executed. Have you studied medical electronics formally? No, sir, just from watching and reading manuals when I can find them. The technician stood silent for a moment, processing implications. Then he pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Anna. Ma'am, I don't know what your daughter's plans are for her education, but she has genuine talent for diagnostic systems analysis. Whoever trains her is going to be incredibly fortunate. He left before Anna could formulate a response, his words hanging in the air like a promise of futures that seemed impossible yesterday, but inevitable today. Michael Thompson finished his phone calculations and turned to face Anna and Angela directly. His expression had settled into something harder to read. Not quite gratitude, not exactly humility, but perhaps the beginning of recognition that he owed something to the people he'd been actively mocking minutes earlier. We need to talk, he said, his voice carrying none of the previous cruelty, about what just happened, and about what I offered. Anna's hand tightened on Angela's shoulder, protective instinct rising, even as she recognized that this conversation would determine their immediate future in ways she couldn't control or predict. Her daughter had spoken truth to power. Now they would discover what power did with truth when it came from the most unlikely source. The restoration of the monitoring system wasn't gradual or uncertain. It was instantaneous, a binary transformation from catastrophic failure to perfect function that defied the usual troubleshooting process where fixes were implemented cautiously, tested incrementally, verified before commitment. The lead surgical technician, David Martinez, had 23 years of experience with medical technology. He'd troubleshot thousands of equipment failures, had developed the methodical patience that separated competent technicians from excellent ones, had learned that rushing repairs caused more problems than they solved, but circumstances had eliminated the luxury of caution. Dr. Webb was operating blind on a woman whose life hung by surgical precision without the technological support that made that precision possible. Every second without monitoring was another second of compounding risk, another moment when subtle changes could cascade into catastrophic complications. So when Angela identified the auxiliary power node connection, when her diagnosis aligned with symptoms in ways that sophisticated software had missed, David made a decision that violated every protocol about verifying fixes before implementation. He pressed the loose cable connection firmly home, ensuring full contact, and prayed that an 11-year-old girl's diagnostic intuition was more reliable than his decades of professional experience. The response was immediate and absolute. The alarm cascade that had been screaming through the operating room ceased instantly, replaced by the normal, rhythmic beeping that accompanied successful surgery. The error displays that had been blazing crimson with cascading warnings cleared in synchronized sequence, replaced by the calm blue interfaces that showed stable, nominal function. Most dramatically, the monitoring screens that had been dark or showing error messages suddenly filled with data. Margaret Thompson's vital signs resuming their steady patterns, every parameter within expected ranges, every measurement confirming that despite the crisis, the patient remained stable. David stared at his screens with an expression that mixed relief, disbelief, and the uncomfortable recognition that a child had just out-diagnosed his entire team. The system restoration was so complete, so immediate, that it retroactively confirmed Angela's analysis. This hadn't been software corruption or hardware failure or any of the complex problems they'd been chasing. It had been a loose cable, a physical connection that had degraded just enough to interrupt data transmission while still registering as technically connected. The kind of simple problem that experienced technicians often overlooked because their training led them to assume complex systems required complex solutions. All systems nominal, David announced to the surgical team, his voice carrying the steady professionalism that disguised his inner turmoil. Full monitoring restored, all data streams operational. Dr. Chen's hands moved across her controls, verifying every parameter with the intensity of someone who'd just been forced to operate without technological support and wasn't quite ready to trust its return. Confirming restoration, heart rate 72, stable rhythm, blood pressure 120/80, oxygen saturation 98%, respiratory function nominal, anesthesia depth optimal. She looked up at Dr. Webb, her expression showing the particular relief of medical professionals who'd just navigated crisis without losing the patient. All parameters are excellent, Marcus. She weathered the monitoring failure without complication. Dr. Webb nodded acknowledgement, but his hands never paused in their systematic work. He was completing the final sutures on Margaret Thompson's repaired mitral valve, closing the repair site with practiced precision, preparing to begin the careful process of closing her chest and returning her from the vulnerable exposure of surgery toward recovery. Time since monitoring failure? He asked. 2 minutes, 47 seconds, Dr. Morrison reported. Felt like an hour, but we were only blind for 2 minutes 47 seconds. The number should have been reassuring. Less than 3 minutes without monitoring was manageable, especially with manual observation providing backup. But everyone in the operating room understood how quickly those minutes could have become catastrophic if Angela's diagnosis had been wrong or delayed. If the crisis had extended another minute or two while they chased incorrect theories about what had failed. The surgical team worked in renewed silence, their movements synchronized back into the practiced efficiency that characterized successful operations. But the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. They were no longer experts confidently executing routine procedure. They were professionals who'd been rescued by an 11-year-old observer, who'd been shown their limitations by someone without credentials or training or any of the markers that defined expertise in their world. Dr. Webb completed the valve repair and began the systematic closure process. Pericardium, sternum, tissue layers, skin. Each step executed with the controlled precision that would minimize Margaret Thompson's recovery time, that would transform today's controlled trauma into tomorrow's healing. Estimated time to close? He asked. 35 minutes, Dr. Morrison replied. We're ahead of schedule despite the monitoring crisis. Above them in the observation gallery, Michael Thompson watched his mother's surgery proceed toward successful conclusion with an expression that had transformed from desperate fear to something more complicated. Relief, certainly. His mother had survived both the cardiac repair and the technological failure that had threatened to kill her. But also something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or the beginning of understanding that his cruel challenge had exposed his own limitations as much as anyone else's, that his mockery had been directed at the very person who possessed what he needed. The operating room maintained its focus on the patient, on the technical execution that would ensure successful outcome. But a parallel drama was unfolding in the observation gallery, a drama about debts incurred through mockery, about promises made in cruelty but delivered before witnesses, about what powerful people did when forced to acknowledge that salvation came from sources they'd dismissed as irrelevant. Angela stood beside her mother, watching the surgery proceed toward completion, aware that something fundamental had shifted, but not yet understanding the full implications. She'd seen a problem, identified the solution, spoken when adults would have remained silent out of deference to hierarchy and credentials. She'd done what her brilliant, unconventional mind was designed to do. And in doing so, she'd stepped into a spotlight that would define her future in ways neither she nor Anna could yet comprehend. Below them, Dr. Boss Webb completed another suture, bringing Margaret Thompson one step closer to recovery, one step closer to seeing her son again, one step closer to the life that had nearly ended on this operating table. And in saving that life, Angela had irrevocably changed three others: her own, her mother's, and the man who'd promised $200 million as mockery, but would now discover whether his word carried weight beyond his immediate convenience. The impossible fix had been accomplished. Now came the reckoning of what that fix cost and who would pay the debt it created. Michael Thompson's first instinct was retreat. Not physical withdrawal, but the strategic repositioning that powerful men executed when circumstances threatened to expose them to obligations they'd never intended to honor. That was fortunate, he said, his tone carefully calibrated to reframe what had just occurred. The technicians were close to identifying the problem anyway. Your daughter just happened to spot it first. The words hung in the observation gallery, a transparent attempt to minimize Angela's contribution, to transform her diagnostic genius into lucky timing, to create distance between Michael's cruel challenge and the debt it had created. Anna felt something ignite in her chest, not the slow burn of accumulated resentment, but the immediate flame of maternal protectiveness combined with 15 years of swallowed indignities finally finding voice. "No," she said, the single word cutting across Michael's attempted dismissal with unexpected force. "That's not what happened, and everyone in this hospital knows it." Michael turned toward her, his expression showing surprise that quickly shifted toward warning. He wasn't accustomed to being contradicted, especially not by service staff whose positions depended on his family's goodwill and the hospital administration's desire to maintain wealthy donors. "Excuse me?" His voice carried the particular edge that preceded consequences for people who forgot their designated place. But Anna had spent 15 years knowing her place, 15 years staying invisible and silent, 15 years watching her brilliant daughter's potential go unrecognized because acknowledging it would mean challenging hierarchies that benefited from their invisibility. And watching Angela step forward despite fear, watching her daughter speak truth despite knowing she'd be dismissed, had broken something in Anna's careful accommodation to circumstances. "I said no," Anna repeated, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "You're not going to diminish what my daughter just did. You're not going to pretend she got lucky or that the technicians were close to solving the problem. They weren't. They were chasing complex theories about software failures and hardware problems. They would have spent another 10 minutes running diagnostics while your mother's surgery proceeded without monitoring." "You don't know that," Michael said, his tone hardening. "I know exactly that. I've worked here 15 years. I've watched technicians troubleshoot equipment failures dozens of times. I know the protocols, the systematic approach, the time it takes to isolate problems in complex integrated systems." Anna stepped closer, her professional courtesy dropping away to reveal the fierce protectiveness beneath. "Angela diagnosed the problem in seconds by seeing what trained experts missed. She saved your mother's life, Mr. Thompson. And you're trying to pretend it was coincidence because acknowledging the truth means honoring the promise you made." Michael's jaw clenched, his hands forming fists at his sides. He was a man accustomed to controlling narratives, to shaping reality through force of will and strategic manipulation. Having a nurse, a black woman from the service class he'd spent his life ordering around, confront him publicly about his obligations was intolerable. "I made no promise," he said coldly. "I made a joke, a sarcastic comment during a crisis. If you think that constitutes a binding—" $200 million, Anna interrupted, her voice carrying across the gallery. "That's what you offered. In front of hospital staff, in front of cameras that record these observation galleries for medical education purposes, in front of witnesses who heard every word. You pointed at my daughter and said, 'Fix this kid, and I'll give you 200 million. Those were your exact words." Michael's expression shifted as he registered the implication. The observation gallery did have recording equipment, standard protocol for teaching hospitals. His cruel challenge hadn't been private mockery, it had been captured on institutional systems that documented surgical procedures. "You're threatening me?" The question emerged as dangerous statement rather than inquiry. "I'm stating facts," Anna said, though her voice trembled slightly now that direct confrontation with a mafia boss became reality rather than abstract courage. "My daughter kept her part of your agreement. She fixed the problem. She saved your mother. The question is whether your word means anything, or whether you're the kind of man who makes promises he never intends to honor." The gallery went silent, except for the muted sounds of surgery continuing below. Angela watched her mother with wide eyes, simultaneously proud and terrified, recognizing that Anna had just put their entire future at risk by demanding accountability from someone who'd built an empire on never being held accountable. Michael's phone buzzed again, his organization continuing to function, continuing to require decisions, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding in a hospital observation gallery. He silenced it without looking, his attention focused entirely on Anna, his mind clearly calculating options and consequences. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he said quietly, the kind of quiet that preceded violence or destruction. "What I could do to you, what I could do to your daughter, how easily I could make your life here impossible." "I know exactly who you're talking to," Anna replied, her voice stronger now despite the threat. "A woman who spent 15 years cleaning up after wealthy people who treat her like furniture. A mother who's watched her brilliant daughter go unrecognized because people like you can't imagine that genius might exist in children who don't attend private schools or carry the right last names. A nurse who just watched her child save your mother's life while you stood there helpless." She took a breath, committing fully to a confrontation that couldn't be walked back. "You can threaten me. You can make my life difficult. You can probably get me fired and blacklisted from every hospital in the city. But you can't change what happened here. You can't erase the fact that when your money and power couldn't save your mother, my daughter's brilliance did. And if you're the kind of man who repays that by destroying us, then everyone in this hospital will know exactly what your word is worth." Michael stared at her, his expression cycling through anger, calculation, and something that might have been reluctant respect. Anna had just cornered him with the only leverage service workers ever possessed against powerful employers, reputation, and the threat of its damage. He could destroy Anna and Angela quietly. But he couldn't do it without confirming that he was a man who welched on debts, who made promises he didn't honor, who responded to being saved by attacking his saviors. That kind of reputation had costs even for mafia bosses, created vulnerabilities that rivals could exploit, undermined the image of honorable criminality that Michael had cultivated throughout his career. "You're very brave, or very stupid," Michael said finally. "I'm a mother," Anna replied simply, "and my daughter deserves better than being dismissed by the man whose mother she saved." Michael's phone buzzed again. He looked at it this time, then back at Anna, then down at Angela, who stood quietly watching the adults negotiate her future with the focused attention she'd given the error displays. "Fine," he said, the word emerging like admission of defeat. "We'll talk. About what happened. About what I offered. About what your daughter's contribution means." He gestured toward the door. "But not here. Not in a hospital gallery where everything's recorded and everyone's watching. Somewhere private. Tomorrow. You bring her. We discuss terms." Anna nodded slowly, recognizing both victory and new danger. She'd forced Michael to acknowledge the debt. Now came the far more complicated question of how he'd choose to pay it. With honor, or with the kind of compromise that benefited him while technically meeting obligations. "Tomorrow," Anna agreed. "Somewhere public, with witnesses. Because I don't trust private meetings with men who tried to dismiss their promises 5 minutes after they were fulfilled." Michael's expression showed he'd just been cornered again. this time by someone who understood that accepting his terms meant accepting his control. He'd expected gratitude and deference from the nurse whose daughter he'd just offered to compensate. Instead, he'd encountered a mother who understood exactly how powerful men operated and refused to play by rules designed to ensure their advantage. "You're making this very complicated," he said. "No," Anna replied. "You made it complicated when you offered $200 million as mockery. I'm just insisting you deal with the consequences of your words being taken seriously." Below them, Dr. Webb completed the final suture that closed Margaret Thompson's chest. The surgery was done, the patient had survived, and in the observation gallery above, 3 lives had just collided in ways that would reshape all their futures. Michael Thompson had learned that genius wore no uniform. Anna Landers had learned that maternal courage could challenge power. And Angela had learned that speaking truth, regardless of consequences, sometimes changed everything. 3 weeks after Margaret Thompson's successful surgery, Anna and Angela sat in a conference room at Michael Thompson's legitimate business headquarters, a gleaming office tower in the financial district that housed the investment firms and consulting companies that laundered his criminal empire through respectable enterprise. The meeting space was deliberately impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that cost more than Anna's annual salary, the kind of calculated wealth display that reminded visitors exactly whose territory they'd entered. Michael had insisted on this location, maintaining control through environment, even as Anna had insisted on bringing a lawyer, a family attorney who'd agreed to attend more out of curiosity than any expectation of compensation. Michael entered with 2 people Anna didn't recognize. A woman in her 50s carrying a tablet, and a man perhaps 40 whose expensive suit and careful posture suggested legal representation. No bodyguards visible, though Anna assumed they were close. "Mrs. Landers, Angela." Michael nodded acknowledgement, his tone professional rather than warm. "Thank you for coming. I want to discuss how to properly compensate Angela for her contribution to my mother's surgery." He sat across from them, his body language communicating control despite Anna's insistence on public meeting space with witnesses. This was still his territory, his negotiation, his terms being discussed even if Anna had forced the discussion to occur. "Before we begin," Michael continued, "I want to be clear about something. What Angela did was remarkable, genuinely remarkable. She saw what trained professionals missed. She spoke up despite having every reason to stay silent. She saved my mother's life." The words emerged with sincerity that surprised Anna. No attempt at minimization, no qualification about technicians being close to solving the problem, just acknowledgement of debt, delivered by someone who'd clearly spent 3 weeks processing what had occurred and reached conclusions about how to proceed. "I made an offer in anger and fear," Michael said. $200 million. Said as mockery, witnessed by multiple people, captured on hospital recording systems. "My legal team," he gestured toward the man beside him, "informs me that while the offer might not constitute legally binding contract, attempting to renege would create reputation problems I'd prefer to avoid." Anna felt her lawyer tense beside her, recognizing they'd just been offered negotiating leverage that Michael didn't have to acknowledge. The smart move would be pressing for the full amount, enforcing the literal terms of Michael's challenge. But Michael wasn't finished. "However, I'd like to propose something different. Not instead of compensation, but in addition to it. Something that might serve Angela better than a lump sum payment she's too young to manage responsibly." He nodded to the woman beside him, who activated her tablet and projected financial documents onto the conference room's screen. Numbers appeared: trusts, educational funds, investment accounts, in configurations that made Anna's head spin trying to process their implications. "I'm proposing we structure Angela's compensation as follows," Michael said. "First, $50 million in an irrevocable trust that becomes accessible when she turns 25, managed by independent trustees, invested conservatively, providing security regardless of what else happens in her life." Anna's breath caught. $50 million. The number was incomprehensible, life-changing, generational wealth that would eliminate every financial pressure she and Angela had ever faced. Second, Michael continued, a comprehensive educational fund covering tuition, living expenses, and educational support from now through whatever advanced degrees Angela chooses to pursue. MIT, Stanford, wherever she gains admission, fully funded, no restrictions. He pulled up additional documentation. Third, and this is where I'd like your particular attention, I've been in contact with Dr. Sarah Chen, the anesthesiologist who worked on my mother's surgery. She was impressed by Angela's diagnostic ability. She's agreed to mentor Angela, introducing her to medical technology specialists, helping her develop her skills in structured ways rather than through observation alone. Michael looked directly at Angela now, his expression carrying respect rather than the mockery that had characterized their first interaction. You have genuine talent, Angela, rare talent, the kind that could change how medical technology systems are designed and troubleshot. But talent needs cultivation, mentorship, opportunities to grow in environments that recognize its value. He paused, then added, I'm also establishing an internship program at Metropolitan Hospital specifically for young people interested in medical technology, regardless of their economic background or conventional academic credentials. You'll be the first participant. Structured learning combined with hands-on experience, starting this summer if you're interested. Anna struggled to process the scope of what was being offered, not just money, though the financial security was transformative, but recognition of Angela's abilities, investment in her potential, pathways toward futures that had seemed impossible 3 weeks ago. Why? Anna asked finally. This is far more than you offered, more than any court could enforce. Michael's expression softened slightly. Because my mother is alive to meet her first grandchild next month, because your daughter had courage to speak when everyone else stayed silent. Because I've spent 3 weeks thinking about how I almost dismissed the person who saved the most important life in my world. Because talent like Angela's shouldn't be wasted serving champagne at galas or cleaning hospital rooms while brilliant minds go unrecognized. He leaned forward. I built my empire on understanding value and investing in it strategically. Your daughter has extraordinary value. This isn't charity. It's investment in someone who might revolutionize how medical technology operates, who might save thousands of lives through innovations we can't yet imagine. And it's acknowledgement that I was wrong. About her. About what genius looks like. About who deserves opportunities. Anna looked at Angela, who'd been quiet throughout the meeting, processing adult negotiations about her future. What do you think, baby? Angela considered carefully before responding. I'd like to learn more. About the systems, about how they're designed, about how to make them better so they don't fail when people need them most. Michael nodded. Then we have an agreement. My legal team will prepare documentation. Everything formalized, protected, guaranteed regardless of what happens to me or my business interests. Angela's future secured, her education funded, her talent recognized and cultivated. He stood, extending his hand toward Anna. Thank you for demanding I honor my word. Thank you for raising a daughter brave enough to speak truth to power. And thank you for giving me the chance to repay a debt I can never fully settle. Anna shook his hand, feeling the surreal transformation of their circumstances. 3 weeks ago, she'd been invisible service staff. Today, she was negotiating her daughter's future with a mafia boss who'd learned that genius recognized no boundaries of age, race, or economic circumstance. 6 months later, Angela walked through MIT's campus on a special summer program for exceptional young students, her brilliant mind finally operating in environments designed to cultivate, rather than constrain, unusual intelligence. She'd become minor celebrity in medical technology circles, the 11-year-old who'd diagnosed what experts missed, the child genius whose moment of courage had exposed how conventional credentialing sometimes blinded institutions to talent presenting in unexpected forms. But Angela wasn't interested in celebrity. She was interested in systems, in understanding how complex integrations worked and failed, in developing innovations that would make medical technology more reliable, more intuitive, more resilient against the kind of catastrophic failures that put lives at risk. Anna had left her hospital position not from pressure but from choice, accepting a role managing the internship program Michael had established, ensuring other overlooked young people with unconventional talents would have opportunities Angela had lacked. Margaret Thompson had recovered fully, had met her grandchild, had learned the story of how her life had been saved by a child nobody had been looking at. She'd insisted on meeting Angela personally, had embraced the girl who'd given her more years with her family, had added her own contribution to Angela's educational trust. And Michael Thompson had learned the most expensive lesson of his career, that $200 million offered in mockery had purchased something more valuable than the money itself. It had purchased humility, recognition that power and wealth didn't guarantee wisdom, and understanding that the people society trained him to overlook often possessed exactly what circumstances required. He visited Angela's summer program once, watching her work with diagnostic equipment, seeing her explain complex system architecture to graduate students twice her age with the natural authority of someone who understood her subject matter at fundamental levels. Worth every penny, he'd muttered to himself, recognizing that his cruel challenge had accidentally created exactly the kind of legacy that would outlast his criminal empire. A brilliant young mind given opportunity to transform fields that touched countless lives. Angela looked up from her work, saw Michael watching, and offered a small wave of acknowledgement. No resentment for his initial mockery, no particular gratitude for his subsequent generosity, just recognition that they'd both played roles in a moment that had changed trajectories for everyone involved. "Thank you for letting me fix it," Angela called across the lab, her words carrying double meaning. "Thank you for the challenge, however cruel its delivery. Thank you for the opportunity, however reluctant its honoring. Thank you for learning that genius wears no uniform and recognizes no hierarchy except the hierarchy of truth." Michael nodded acknowledgement, then left the lab, returning to his empire and the complicated legacy of a man who'd built power through violence but would be remembered for recognizing brilliance when it appeared in the most unlikely form. And Angela returned to her work, her mind already solving problems that would save lives, her future guaranteed not by the money Michael had provided, but by the recognition that her unconventional genius finally had space to flourish. The nurse's daughter had become the engineer who would change how medical technology served human vulnerability. And it had all started with a cruel challenge, a brave answer, and a loose cable that exposed how the most critical solutions often came from the most overlooked sources. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as you can ever imagine.